Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event. It is actually the first in a series of events that we at SUM, Center for Development and the Environment, where I work, has called Can SUM Save the Planet? Researchers, we work on different tiny little issues and topics, most of us at least, and we don't develop the big answers to the big questions in general. But we know that we're in the middle of the multiple crises, climate, nature loss, biodiversity, and a social crisis. And the public wants real answers from us. So that's why we've started this series. And of course, we could have no better way to start it off, to kick it off, than with Jason Hickel that's visiting. Because he's one of those researchers that is different, that actually has the courage to publish real answers and plans and how to move forward in this multiple and intractable and really, really serious crisis. He's even published a book with the title, How Degrowth Will Save the World. So today's event has been possible because we have collaborated with something called the Green Office. It is an arena that's student-led at the University of Oslo, a student-led arena for engagement in issues related to the environment and climate. So you can go there to find inspiration, both for how to change your own life to how to change the world. And today I have with me Holly Benna, who is going to be, or is today's impatient student. She's going to question Jason Hickel. Most of you who are here, you already know who he is and where he works and what he stands for. So I'm not going to go a lot into that, but he is this year's holder of the prestigious Arne Næss Chair. He is an economic anthropologist, fellow at the Royal Society of Arts, and professor at the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. The format for this session is going to be that I'm going to moderate. It is Holly Benna who is going to ask the main questions, and it's going to be what I would call a friendly conversation. We want to learn more about degrowth. We want to learn more about how it differs, how those ideas differ from other ideas that are out there, what needs to happen in order to make a real transformative change, to start a real transformative change, and to make it happen. We're not going to go on for 2 hours. We're planning to have a conversation for about 1 hour, and then an open dialogue with the public for another half hour, and plan to end by 7:30. Probably I should say who I am before I start. My name is Benedicte. I'm a professor of political science at the Center for Development and the Environment. I would like to start by some questions that was left a little bit out in the air yesterday. Some of us attended an Arne Næss symposium yesterday at the University of Oslo with Jason Hickel and a lot of opponents. And
a lot of opponents.
Commentators, okay. Well, at least those that were left to speak. I think the audience were mostly among your fan club. But I was left a bit curious about what degrowth really means at the end of the day. So I was thinking to start, to be able to assure that we're all on the same page. Could you explain what degrowth means, how it actually differs from other concepts? Because we have other concepts out there that also try to kind of look at the future with less climate emissions, with less use of natural resources, and a future that's more socially just. But what distinguishes degrowth from other kinds of thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's pretty straightforward, actually, in a way. So the objective for pretty much anyone in environmentalist circles, I suppose, is more or less the same, which is to create an ecological economy, an ecological society. And this, of course, for rich nations, involves pretty significantly scaling down material use and obviously emissions. to achieve the Paris climate objectives. The observation that degrowth makes is simply that, yes, technology change is really important to this, and also efficiency improvements have to play a critically important role, and we need to accelerate processes of technological change and efficiency, and so on. But that alone is not going to be enough. What's also going to be necessary is to directly scale down certain forms of production, socially less necessary forms of production that are particularly destructive, particularly energy intensive, and we just don't need for the sake of human well-being, right? So there's huge chunks of our economy that are just irrelevant for well-being and mostly exist to serve the interests of capital accumulation and elite consumption. And it's simply the realization that in the middle of an ecological emergency, it is madness to continue devoting energy and materials to producing those things. So that's, I think, the main thing that kind of divides degrowth from green growth, right? I mean, degrowth is not an anti-technology position. It's a pro-technology position. It simply recognizes that technology alone is not enough. And yeah, we have to deal with the underlying production system. Now, it also differs, I have to say, from conventional mainstream bourgeois green politics, which tends to, A, not recognize the fact that we have to address the underlying economic system, which is capitalism, right? And then the second thing is that bourgeois green politics tends to sort of peddle in like narratives of guilt about individual behavior and overconsumption and so on. And that is, look, I mean, it has some traction, but clearly you can't build a mass political movement with a politics of guilt and so on. And plus, it's not ultimately consumption really that matters. What matters is the underlying, again, production system. Because a lot of people under capitalism have critical shortages of consumption of necessary goods, right? People who cannot access affordable housing, cities that don't have public transit, people who live in food deserts, et cetera, et cetera. And these problems are clearly not addressed by simply a politics of let's consume less, right? And so I think that we have to focus on the fact that we have a double crisis, a social crisis and an ecological crisis driven by the same underlying structural drivers. And we need a politics and a program that can effectively address both by reorganizing our system of production to produce to increase production of what we know is necessary for human needs and well-being and ecology, and reduce production of things that are not.
But isn't that precisely what some of the green growthers also argue, that you should produce less of those products that are that use more natural resources and make more emissions? Isn't that pretty much the same?
In some cases, yes, although one of their main conceits is that, while doing this, well, whatever they propose, is going to lead to continued increases in GDP. And GDP is simply a measure of aggregate production and market prices. I guess what we recognize is the fact that if we're serious about this kind of transformation, then it's likely that GDP is going to decline in rich countries. But that's okay, because GDP is not a measure of social progress or innovation or human well-being, et cetera, et cetera. It's simply a measure of all the stuff you produce in the economy in terms of their market prices. And a lot of the things we want to produce actually don't have high market prices, things like public transit or public health care. And so GDP is not a good way to capture the value that those things represent in the first place. And so for degrowth, it's simply a matter of saying the level of GDP is not actually that important. What matters is what we are producing and whether people have access to the essential goods and services that we know to be necessary to live decent lives for all. That's what matters. And so this is going to involve probably some GDP reduction, but that's never the objective, and I want to be very clear about that. Like, GDP may decline as a result of socially and ecologically beneficial policy, but it's obviously not the objective. But we do have to think about how to manage an economy in the absence of perpetually increasing GDP, because our existing economies are addicted to that, right? If you have a decline in that, then that's trouble. And so this is the entire field of post-growth economic research, to investigate what an economy would look like that is stable and meets human needs in the absence of perpetually increasing GDP.
I would like to put more into that, but I think I'm going to leave the word to Holly, who's our main, who's going to take the lead on the questions, and I might jump in at some points when I'm not able to hold it back anymore. But please, Holly.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, first of all, I just want to say congratulations on the success of the book. I think it really shows that people are really craving a story that they can hold on to that connects local and global action and really centers around justice. And so we're all really excited about that. That's why we're here today. And we've talked a bit now already about the differences between degrowth and then some of the more contemporary other environmental movements and ways of thinking. But I think degrowth is a school of thought with a really rich intellectual history. And so that's something I wanted to ask you about. Because it doesn't only bring up new ideas, it also brings back into the public imagination things that have been critiqued in the past and then have kind of come out of fashion in a way. So, for example, in 1972, the Limits to Growth report predicted crisis between 2030 and 2040 if we didn't challenge the business-as-usual paradigms. And neoliberalism pushed this kind of thinking out of the mainstream. And so I wanted to ask you kind of, what does this iteration of challenging limits bring to the table that's different than the past?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, clearly the limits to growth, I mean, in some ways are responsible for spawning the modern Western environmentalist movement, and so there's an important history there, and the model is actually pretty impressive, and is still used today. But there's been a pretty important transformation, I think, in I guess radical environmental thoughts or post-growth thought since the limits to growth. The limits to growth basically argued that eventually growth is going to run into limits, and like the limits of resource availability and so on, and is going to start to crash, and that will be a problem. And so you don't want to grow too much to avoid running into this crash situation, right? But the critics of limits to growth immediately pointed out that technology innovation is going to allow us to access new resources that we can't access today, and therefore expand the pool of available resources. And they proved to be right. And this, I think, is something that we have to pay attention to, right? Like, technological innovation is very powerful. And like fracking is an example. So for a while, everyone was talking about peak oil. And then suddenly, we invented the capacity to do fracking and other kind of non-conventional oil plays. And we can extract a lot more than we could before. So now it's actually understood that the problem is not that growth is going to run into a wall or a limit. The problem is that it might not, right? And in the process might create extraordinary ecological devastation that leaves us in a very bad position, as we're already seeing. And so the objective is not to sort of wait or try to predict when growth is going to run into a wall, but rather to plan democratically to transition to an economy that doesn't require perpetual growth so as to avoid the kind of ecological degradation that would leave us in a bad situation. And so this is interesting because it's like, in some ways it's better. It's scientifically more informed. It's more technologically savvy, but also recognizes that it brings agency back into the question, like political agency back into the question. We're not on a machine that is a juggernaut that we can't stop. Like we can reassert agency over how the economy is organized and transform it. And that's something that we should do in a positive way, not out of fear of some kind of eventual crash, right? A positive way because that's a better economy, an economy that we want to have. So I think that's the main conceptual transformation. And it's really been driven a lot by the planetary boundaries research, right? Like a lot of ecological degradation and overshoot begins to occur before you run into the resource limits to growth. And that's what we want to prevent.
Yeah, thank you. That's super great. Another question that I have kind of relating to the concept of agency is, who are the agents of change? And I know degrowth scholarship has a lot of discussion between more anarchist schools of thought and then also more policy-oriented thinking. And so I'm curious to see like where you land on that continuum and who you see as the political protagonists and who are going to make these changes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is like an underdeveloped part of the book, actually, I should say, and I've tried to think more about it since then. I mean, degrowth in some ways kind of emerged primarily, and post-growth as well, from scientists, from academia, and has mostly been an empirical project, and puts forward policy proposals that I think are very convincing and powerful and exciting, but has done a lot less to research the political possibilities that might be available, or what kinds of conditions would enable this kind of transformation to occur. And that research is occurring now. On the other hand, there's also been like the grassroots degrowth movements, which in the past have tended to be focused on kind of localism a little bit, and have been anarchist, I think, in inspiration. And I think the limits to that approach are pretty apparent to everybody. You have to be able to build mass movements that can present a compelling vision of what an industrial civilization is going to look like in a post-growth economy, right? So this is not like a everyone's got to go back to the land kind of arrangement, you know. And I think for that, it's really clear. I mean, again, degrowth research, post-growth research puts forward what such a civilization could look like. But to get there, you need more than the existing environmentalist movement, which I think we should all agree, we should all face up to the fact that does not have what it takes to achieve the kind of transformation that we require. It tends to lack a structural assessment of how capitalism works and what needs to be overcome about capitalism. It tends to neglect class analysis and can't build the kind of broad-based political movement that I think is necessary. And to do that, it's critically important that environmentalists build alliances with labor unions and with working-class political formations that have a lot more political leverage, including the power of the strike, and also, of course, in order to build a broader base of political movement. But in order to do that, then social policy has to be at the core of the vision and has to be at the core of the demands. And this, again, departs from the bourgeois green parties, which tend to have green policy without much thought to social policy. And that scares people, right? Because if you're going to talk about scaling down certain industries but don't have a clear plan for how this is going to not negatively affect people's livelihoods, then this is going to be a politics of failure. And so to address the social insecurity that capitalism produces, alongside the ecological devastation that capitalism produces, that must be the objective of any successful political movement.
I'm just a bit curious about who are you talking about when you're talking about the bourgeois green parties. It's, it doesn't really ring a bell here in Norway. We have a green party. I'm sure many of you are members, and what you're actually talking about is kind of a green socialism compared to any other green politics, or what is it?
Yeah.
It doesn't really fit with the political landscape here in Norway.
No, in fact, I don't think it really fits in the political landscape of any country. Because it only makes sense when you think about international comparisons, actually. Because there are some green parties within Europe that are effectively eco-socialist and take very seriously social concerns and have a very clear post-capitalist vision. And there are other green parties, such as the German Greens, for example, that are basically neoliberal. And there's kind of a spectrum between them, right? And so I think that we have to pay attention to what kind of green politics we're talking about. But in general, regardless of what the actual content of the green politics might be, I think that there's actually a lot of distrust of green parties, simply because the image that they tend to have for people, I think, is mostly middle-class people who are comfortable enough to be concerned about the environment and are not super worried about making ends meet on a day-to-day basis, and therefore can engage in questions about, do we consume too much, right? And I don't know about in Norway, but in most of the rest of the world, and I mean, including in wealthy capitalist economies like the USA and the UK, there's so much deprivation that is not, a discourse that people can relate to. And so if there's not some, active analysis of the social problems that we face as well, and how these are going to be addressed together, I think that, this is one of the reasons why I think green parties tend to perform pretty poorly overall in the polls. But it really depends on the context.
You have a lot of other things. I would just like to delve a little bit more into it, because in the book you come up with a number of changes that need to happen. And also in a recent article in Nature, you discuss 5 points that need to be changed about the current capitalist system in order to encourage or to make a green transformation. Those are not really revolutionary thoughts. It's about, it's lots of things that could be, some of it is implemented by actually existing institutions like the EU, and others are to reduce work hours. There's a number of policies that could be proposed by socially concerned politicians. But on the other hand, you want to arrive at a post-capitalist system. How do what is actually the plan here? Or what do you think needs to happen? Is it a reform of the capitalist system with shorter work hours, with jobs in the sunset industries like oil and all of these kind of steps? Or is it a revolution?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think when people think of revolution, they, like for a lot of people who are outside revolutionary traditions, I think that it can be a scary concept because it sounds like a dramatic break. So what we have now is not going to exist, but it's not super clear what it's going to be. And so therefore, it just seems like the abyss, and that's scary, right? And I think that, but that's not, this is not at all the way to approach the question. The approach should be to define very clearly the pathway from here to there, and make it thinkable, a different kind of economy. And that's what I think that we need to try to be doing. And then it becomes clear that the steps to get there are pretty sensible, actually. They're not particularly radical. They're things that most of us would agree on, and in public opinion polls, the vast majority of us support. Things like universal public services or a public job guarantee. These are things that have a lot of widespread support. They don't get implemented in capitalist economies, right? Because they run against the objectives of capital accumulation. I mean, capital requires some kind of structural rates of unemployment to maintain downward pressure on wages. This is essential for capital accumulation. A situation where you have universal employment options is going to work against that. It's going to give a lot of bargaining power to labor. Now, and this is important, right? Like, I think people have difficulty understanding that in a post-capitalist economy, you would still be producing things. You would still have an economy that produces things, and you'd have private producers too. But the objective of that production would not be capital accumulation. The objective would be, concrete social and ecological objectives. You would produce things that that we require. And you would still have a two-sector economy, right, where you have the social foundation provisioned by public services, healthcare, education, transit, energy, water, internet, et cetera, things that would be decommodified or mostly decommodified and available to everybody. And then other forms of provisioning, like beer or watches or laptops. Maybe you want to have private businesses, provisioning those things. But in a post-capitalist context, what would that be? It basically simply means democratic firms. And I think this is so important to understand, is that right now we live in a democratic political system where we occasionally get to elect our official representatives. And we recognize that system is deeply corrupt and captured, and that's problematic. But when it comes to the economic system, the system of production, not even a shadow of democracy enters, right? We have no control over decisions about what we produce, under what conditions, how labor and resources and energy are used, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that the key in a post-capitalist economy would be to democratize private sector production.
So how is that going to be organized then? Is it going to be cooperatives? How are you thinking that private sector production is going to be organized, and who's going to make all the decision about the rest of the production?
I guess also, what are the first steps to take to go towards a more democratized economy?
Yeah, and I should say, I think that more economic democracy is necessary at all levels. It's necessary in the public sector as well, right? In a lot of contexts, public services don't work very well because they're not very democratically responsive. And so we need more democracy over public service provisioning as well, right? Our public housing and our public transit would be better with more, democratic accountability to those services. For the private sector, yeah, cooperatives are the obvious example. In Barcelona, it's very easy for people to understand this because so many of our companies are co-ops, are democratic co-ops. I'm a member of 3 myself. I get my internet from a co-op. I get my energy from a co-op, and I'm a member of an electric car co-op. And all of them are democratically run, and they have particular social and ecological objectives. And they're very successful at what they do. I've never been happier, with the kind of provisioning that I receive than here. So you know, it's fully thinkable, and any size company can be one. Like Mondragon is a massive company in Spain that employs tens of thousands of workers, and they're a democratically run co-op as well. So under democratic conditions, when we sit down together and discuss what we should be producing, we'll quickly come up with solutions. Like maybe in the middle of an ecological emergency, we shouldn't agree to produce private jets, right? Let's use our labor and our resources and productive capacities to produce something else that's more necessary right now. These are the kinds of decisions we could make under those conditions, which I think is extremely exciting, actually.
Yeah. I have another question as well about agents of change, and I just wanted to ask you, because we're at the university today, what you see the role of the university and also students in building this movement.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. Yeah, I think that, look, there's a lot of research that has to be done. And this has been so exciting for me because it's like an area of research that I feel is like, it's intellectually rigorous, it's scientifically rigorous, but also it feels so relevant and exciting, and things are opening up all the time, like new ideas are forming. And I think that for people who want to get involved in research, the many different interdisciplinary interventions that are occurring in post-growth research is a very exciting field. And we need a lot more hands on deck, as it were, for this. The European Union is in the process of financing a lot of new big grants on this. And so if you're looking for master's and PhD programs that focus on these kinds of issues, then there's going to be a lot of those opportunities in the coming years. As far as students, I think that student movements are absolutely essential to changing culture, actually. If you think about like major changes that have occurred in the 20th century, I mean, there's basically labor movements and student movements, and they're obviously most powerful when they're together. Right now in the 21st century, we have another one, which is the environmentalist movements. And I think building alliances between these three with coordinated demands is going to be, you know, super important for the success of progressive politics. And I want to emphasize, like movement building like this is a very serious job. It's not about words. It's about, you know, real door-to-door organizing, real alliance building, real concerted effort in this way that I think a lot of us are not really that familiar with. But I'll mention this briefly. I was very inspired as a PhD student when one of my professors forced me to watch this documentary called Eyes on the Prize, which was about the civil rights struggle in the USA. And it really opened my eyes to to the intensity of organizing that was necessary to achieve the objectives that the civil rights movement succeeded in achieving. It's not easy when you're up against you know, a system that is doing everything to crush you. And I think those are the kind of tactics, those are the kind of lessons we need to learn from successful movements like that in the past.
And yeah, I think talking about building social movements, I think it's also really crucial that we talk about language as well. And this was touched on during the conversation yesterday, but I wanted to revisit it. This spring, I saw Vandana Shiva speak here in Oslo, and one of the things that she talked about quite a bit was the importance of both biodiversity and of diversity of thought, especially in movement building. And someone asked her a question near the end of her talk, pointing out that she didn't actually name capitalism as the culprit for the crisis, and she responded with, "I won't honor capitalism as a creative force. I want to call out colonialism. Capitalism is colonial commerce, and growth is a lubricant of this economy of theft." And so the question that I want to ask you is, how important is it to name capitalism, and what are some of the links between degrowth and decolonization? And then also a broader question is, in social movements, does it make sense to kind of have there be more space for diversity of language that's used depending on different contexts? So those are three huge questions.
Yeah, I think the diversity of language and concepts is actually really important. It facilitates diversity of thought, and I think that is only a strength. As far as the language about capitalism, yeah, I mean, to me, I actually do think that using, I thought you were going to ask about the word degrowth, and I was going to give you know, my usual response to that, but yeah, I think capitalism actually is indispensable for us, you know, to be able to name and describe, because I think that there's so much misunderstanding about what capitalism actually is, right? I mean, people really tend to believe that capitalism is just businesses and markets and things like that, and they're just like, but these have existed for thousands of years. We're just doing what is natural to humans, to truck and barter and to trade and so on. No. That is not what capitalism is. You know, we have to be very clear-sighted about about how our economy actually is actually organized, like who actually has power over finance and production, what their objectives are, what kind of power we do not have as workers or ordinary people, and how that needs to be changed. So I think that's absolutely crucial, for sure. And I think that...
So how do you define capitalism, then?
I mean,
is capitalism one thing, you think, or is there different forms of capitalism?
I mean, clearly there's different instantiations of capitalism, but the core principle of capitalism is simply when capital controls production. And capital controls production for the purpose of profit. And by capital here, I mean the big financial firms, like BlackRock, for example, that manage a huge quantity of finance. Now, what is finance? What is money? Finance simply represents control or command over our productive capacity, our labor, our collective resources, our energy, right? Capital, finance gets to determine what gets produced. They mobilize us to do things that they want to do, that capital decides is worth doing. Things that are profitable to capital. So we all get mobilized to produce SUVs and private jets, or to curate the lawns of the rich, or to build their mansions. I worked in construction, literally building mansions. I regret those years of my life. Completely wasted labor, when there were people in the city that I was living in who were homeless. Why can't we mobilize our labor to build affordable housing instead of to build mansions? Because affordable housing is not profitable to capital, and so nobody invests in that, right? But in a post-capitalist economy, we mobilize our labor around what is socially and ecologically important.
But just to get it clear, do you think, for example, is China too capitalist or not?
Is China capitalist?
China.
I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, clearly China has been many things. For a while, it was very clearly straight-up communist. And then during the 1990s, went through a massive process of liberalization, which led to extraordinary growth and accumulation, and also devastated people's lives during the 1990s by slashing people's access to many essential basic goods and services. And these days is in a process of recovering, actually, a lot of the public services that were decimated during that period. Like China's making moves now to restore the public health system, which was privatized, to build more public housing, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been this kind of shift, I think, over the past decade. I mean, China's effectively a mixed economy, but what's interesting is that because of the way that finance works in China, the state has a lot of command over private finance in the economy. Now, that's very powerful, because you can see that it enables China to do things a lot faster than we are able to do in Western capitalist countries. Like, if they decide it's really necessary to build a lot of hospitals right away, or if they decide it's really necessary to build a lot of renewable energy capacity right away, they can do that regardless of whether it's profitable to do so, by directing capital in that way, right? That's a power that we do not have, because we don't have that much collective control over financial assets.
And we have something else. We have democracy. And that makes things work a lot slower as well.
Well, I don't think we have democracy, though. That's been my point.
Okay, so you think we're less democratic than China? I'm going to let Holly
go on,
and then we can discuss that one.
No, that's very unfair. I've never said that China's democratic. I definitely did not say that. We have political democracy. China does not have political democracy, at least not in the way that we have it. But what we definitely don't have is economic democracy. And I think that if we did, then we could make much faster decisions about organizing production around what we know to be socially and ecologically necessary, which we can't do right now because we don't have control over capital, right? Again, our own productive capacities. And that's ultimately what we need to change. Now, like, achieving that, I think, is a long-term objective. Well, I mean, hopefully not too long-term. But the more immediate term objectives are things like universal public services and a public job guarantee linked to a green public works program, right? So that you deal with some of the core insecurities and absurdities that our existing capitalist system has, such as unnecessary involuntary unemployment and a scarcity of basic goods, like, again, public transit or renewable energy.
I would like to ask you about one more actor, which is sort of, you're talking about sort of a program all the time, but I'm thinking, who is going to implement this? And the obvious answer is the state. Because the state needs to, who's going to decide on all of this? It's going to be a democracy, but someone has to organize that democracy. It has to be organized in institutions. And how do you think this kind of state should emerge? Because we have the states we have. They're weak. There's a lot of problems with it. There's different degrees of problems. But who's going to be really the major institution that is going to implement all those policies and generate that change? And how are you going to enable that institution to do all of those things?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it is the state, isn't it? I mean, there's no way that small associations of individuals can achieve something like a public job guarantee or universal public services, right? Like, we actually require large-scale intervention to do those kinds of things. You can't build a public transit system as an NGO, right? Like states have to be doing these things. I think the key is simply that again, we need a more effective democratic conversation about what the state should be doing, and I think that's largely precluded even by our so-called democratic political system. Like we actually can't have a very rational conversation. Again, I don't know about the conversation here in Norway, but we can't have a very rational conversation in the UK, for instance. Because our media is overwhelmingly owned by oligarchs and corporations. And so, there's a lot of fear-mongering. Any progressive idea gets immediately crushed and ridiculed, et cetera. And so, these are conditions that democracy can't operate under these conditions, actually. Even things that we know we all agree on in things like citizens' assemblies or public opinion polls never get enacted, right? Because we don't have real democratic systems. And so, but this is a difficult question, right? Like we know that a democratic state would be better and more effective and serve our interests better. But to get there requires overcoming, the obstacles that prevent democracy from working effectively. How do you do that? That's tricky. So I think, a struggle to improve even political democracy in our system is really important.
And unfortunately, we are at the stage where the political democracy is declining rather than strengthening pretty much across the world. Less so, perhaps, here than elsewhere, but there's challenges everywhere. But we're going to move into the global stage before.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
I didn't answer your question about decolonization.
No, I did want to return to that, actually. But maybe we can talk about first, because this is a little bit more directly relevant to what we've been talking about. The question that frames this whole conversation is, can degrowth save the world? And so we really do want to have a global perspective. And discussing capitalism and colonialism, you talk about unequal exchange and the relationships between the global south and the global north. But I just wanted to kind of probe you to nuance that relationship a little bit. And because obviously the global south is not homogeneous, and those dynamics exist on a variety of different scales.
Yeah. It's interesting. The first trade book that I wrote was The Divide. My main passion actually is thinking about international developments and the obstacles that global south countries and governments face in trying to advance their development and industrial capacity and so on. And it was actually through that research that I came to degrowth, when I started understanding the material and energy dimensions and climate dimensions of what's occurring in the world system. And so, for me, degrowth has always been part of an anti-colonial perspective and anti-colonial demands. Growth in the global north depends on an extraordinary plunder of resources and labor and productive capacity from the global south through unequal exchange. And this is a huge drain on the resources and human capacities of the south that could be redirected towards national development objectives. Literally, poverty, like mass poverty as we have it in the world today, is completely unnecessary. It's not like it's always been there and it'll be with us for generations more just because it's so difficult to eradicate poverty. No, it's extremely simple to eradicate poverty, right? But to do it, you have to have some kind of control over your own productive capacity so that you can produce things that people need. Nutritious food, housing, electricity. These are not difficult to produce, actually. Most countries have the domestic resources and labor to do them. Why can't they? Because they don't have control over their own national productive capacities, right? They're limited in their monetary sovereignty. They're under structural adjustment programs that prevent what they can do fiscally. And so they're stuck in this position where they rely on foreign capital to mobilize production domestically. And what does foreign capital mobilize production around? Sweatshops for Zara and plantations for Coca-Cola, right? So huge amounts of productive capacity in the Global South are organized around these when they could be reorganized around human needs. And this is a fundamental problem in the global economy that we have to address. And addressing the growth addiction of capitalist economies in the core of the world system is critical to releasing the Global South from that kind of plunder. But also requires that Global South governments are enabled to use progressive fiscal and monetary and industrial policy to achieve those objectives, which they're presently prevented from doing. And that's a political battle that has to be fought on the world stage for the right to use those policies.
When I listened to you yesterday, I started to feel really, really old when I listened to the first part of the conversation, because I did sort of development studies in the early 1990s, and we then learned about the dependency theories, the world system theories, and how obsolete they were already before I started in the 1990s. And what you presented yesterday to me was almost exactly the same. And then there's been a lot of criticism against the dependency perspectives for many reasons, because some of the experiments to try to develop independently broke down for a variety of reasons, not only the relationships to the north. There's also, I've worked in Latin America for 30 years. There's many reasons why things don't work. Of course, the relationship to northern financial institutions is one issue, but corruption, weak states, a lack of control by states over the whole territory, there's a plethora of other reasons. So I was wondering, how is degrowth different from old dependency theory?
Dependency theory isn't old, though. I mean, it's old.
It's from the 60s.
It's old for Western economists.
Thank you.
It's old for Western economists. And this is a real interesting divide between the West and the Global South, actually, because in Western economics departments, then they just started telling themselves, obviously, that dependency theory was obsolete and couldn't properly explain the world and had nothing to offer, et cetera, right? Why? Because the governments that were implementing policies that were aligned with delinking or national economic sovereignty, this posed a threat to capital accumulation in the Western economies in the 1970s, a direct threat. And the core powers intervened directly to crush them through military coups, through structural adjustment, et cetera. Ideologically, the ideological counterpart of this is you have to crush those ideas too. Purge the universities of Global South Marxist thought, right? Purge them of anti-colonial economic thought. Purge them of thoughts about national economic sovereignty and so on. And they were very successful in doing that. And this is also very well documented how this was done in Global South universities as well during the 80s and 90s. But there has always been a tradition of economists in the Global South who have continued to recognize the dependency dynamics of the world economy, have continued to have an anti-colonial economic theory. And I think now, in the era of social media, where Western economists are paying more attention to, or development theorists are paying more attention to what people in the Global South are saying and have been saying, it's clear that these ideas have been there and are resurging now. And I think that's very exciting.
I think it's a brutal simplification of what's going on in what went on back then in some of the countries, particularly when you take into account the ecological dimension. Because, for example, in Latin America, you had the developmentalists, dependistas, that were arguing exactly that. You needed to be more independent of the global flows in order to build up your own economy. But they were very much concerned, they were very little concerned with the ecological. They wanted to industrialize, and those that have carried on their thoughts in those countries implemented a policy that were more extractive than, or at least as extractive as the neoliberals, precisely to build the national economy, to build the states, to build strong institutions and strong development domestically.
But
and
they
that were
should.
dependent on natural resource extraction.
But
so it
they
was
should.
an equal ecological disaster, but in different hands. Would that be a better solution?
No, this is interesting to me because I used to actually agree with this perspective because I was also schooled in post-development thought and so on. But recently I've come to a different view on this actually because global South states should industrialize, right? And it's obscene that academics in the Western economies sit around saying, oh, but you shouldn't industrialize because it's ecologically destructive, right? The truth is that all lower and middle income countries are well within sustainable levels of resource and energy use. And they need to increase their use of materials and energy in order to deliver the infrastructure necessary for human needs, to build housing and hospitals and universities and so on. Like, this should happen. and I think they were onto something, that we need to build our national industrial capacity in order to be able to meet some of our key national needs. Why shouldn't that, especially given the fact that they are within sustainable levels? So I think this is a very problematic discourse, actually. But you say it's an oversimplification, and it's true. I mean, like a lot of the experiments in national sovereignty were actively crushed by imperialist intervention. But some of them failed on their own. And when it comes to things like import substitution in Latin America, in some cases it was quite successful. In other cases it wasn't as successful. But what we do know for sure is that during the period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, industrial developments and per capita income growth were happening very rapidly across the Global South. And with the imposition of neoliberal reforms and the resubordination of the Global South to international capital in the 80s and 90s, there was huge, long-term, prolonged recessionary tendencies that constrained the consumption of the poorest people on this planet, right? And so if you just think about those two different periods, the 50s, 60s, and 70s versus the 80s and 90s, and ask what was better for people, I mean, it's just abundantly clear that the prior system was more effective. And the states that are succeeding now in achieving, in breaking free from the periphery a little bit and achieving some kind of sovereignty are the ones that have returned to those ideas. I mean, and China is an example of that. And look at the way that the West is now treating China, right? Like, China's per capita income is only like $10,000 a year. It's like 1/7 or 1/8 of what Norway's is. And already there's this fear-mongering, like that it's too much development. They need to be crushed. They need to be contained. I mean, the containment discourse is wild. So we're all about development until you actually have independent industrialization, and then we want to crush you. This is not all right.
But if you... totally agree with you about that, but sort of to continue on the line of thought of Holly about sort of looking at the Global South in a more nuanced way. Last week there was a meeting of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa in Johannesburg. They invited 6 new members. And what came out of that was a document that is a very interesting developmental document. It is about, they are kind of committing to mutually accelerated growth. And that is the whole point. And China is in the lead. China is extracting resources from other countries in the South. In Latin America, the industrialization rate has plummeted after the relationship with China started. And China is bringing out the oil, the metals, everything. So, and that is the Global South today. Those are the most powerful countries in the Global South today. That has their own internal dynamic of resource extraction and maybe even exploitation. So
yeah, and political repression and so on. Yeah, I mean, because they're capitalist economies, right? And this is a major problem, right? And this is a problem that I think the dependistas actually understood in the 1960s, and we need to re-understand again today, which is that, and this is important for Norway, I think, in the context of Norway, and I'm glad I'm here, I get to say this. Like, the core states, the social democracies, have a privilege that no other country in the world has, right? Which is that they can give their working classes a sort of deal, like a reasonable life, allow wages to go up and establish some public services and so on. Never, of course, actually conceding to the real demands of the labor movement for economic democracy and so on, but at least buying them off with enough to keep people more or less okay. And maintain capital accumulation at the same time, right? Because of the imperial arrangements, because you can cheapen labor and resources somewhere else, right? In the periphery, you don't have that option. If you're a capitalist class in the periphery, then if you want to maintain capital accumulation against a working class that is demanding reforms or environmentalist movements that are demanding ecological protections, then you have to repress them. And this is why in the capitalist states in the periphery we see so much political repression, right? We don't see that kind of political repression here when unions go on strike or environmentalists do sit-ins. Nobody gets massacred, right? Because there's some other place that capital can cheapen labor and resources. In the periphery, there's no other place. Unless you can do some kind of sub-imperialism. Although I'm not really comfortable with that term. And this is where China comes in, right? Like, China is a capitalist economy, in addition to the nuances I described earlier. And in order to maintain capital accumulation for Chinese firms, they have to find cheap labor and cheap resources somewhere. And so you see the same tendencies. Capitalist firms run by China and capitalist firms run by Norway in Africa behave very similarly in terms of labor repression and extractivism and so on. So what's the problem? Capital accumulation, right? And so if you want to be able to meet human needs at a good standard in the Global South countries, ultimately some kind of post-capitalist transition there is also going to be required, so that you can mobilize production in a different kind of way with different kinds of objectives. And that's the other side of the story, I guess.
And you still haven't touched on colonialism.
This is colonialism.
I was just going to say this seems.
No, this is the colonial world system, right? Like colonialism didn't end in the 1950s.
So colonialism is whenever there's outbound investments that exploit labor and natural resources. That is colonialism.
No, I think colonialism is a process of value transfer, is a process of appropriation and value transfer, right?
But then is Norway a colonized country? We're essentially a raw material producer. We have a lot of foreign investments in our raw material sector that transfer value. Is Norway colonized?
No, but Norway appropriates value. It doesn't transfer value outward, right? Do you see what I mean? So the way that unequal exchange works is that the core economies, it's a price level differentiation. So the core economies are able to command the heights of innovation activities and keep labor prices high and the resource prices high, et cetera, as opposed to the peripheral countries where all of that is depressed, right? So labor prices are like a fraction of what they are in Norway, and resource prices are a fraction of what they are in Norway, because these lands, these territories have been systematically cheapened by structural adjustment. And therefore, a lot more, a much greater quantity of export has to be shipped off to the core countries in exchange for every little bit of import they receive from the core as a result of these price inequalities, right? Because they can't build up their own domestic.
Oil is priced the same all over the world.
Not labor, though.
Not labor, but oil. Sorry, the natural resources have the same price.
No, well, that's not true. That's not true also, because the cost of extracting oil in Nigeria is a lot cheaper than extracting oil in Norway. The sales price may be the same, but you're getting a lot more profit if you're extracting from somewhere where you can brutally repress the working class and brutally destroy the environment without much concern for repair and so on, right? It's costly, actually, to pollute in Norway. It's not costly to pollute in Nigeria, because environmental protection laws have all been eviscerated. So there's a real difference, actually. But back to my definition about colonialism, it's about appropriation and value transfer. And so under political colonization, this was very clear, where you're directly forcing the population to produce the things that you want to consume in the metropole, right? And draining their lands of those resources and that labor, effectively, for your own appropriation. Everybody agrees this was occurring for the first 450 years of capitalism. With political decolonization, and then we had the rise of economic sovereignty in the South, which was then destroyed in the 1980s by structural adjustment. And the exact system was put back in place, although without military occupation. The idea being effectively, let's organize production in the Global South states around what we want them to produce for us, rather than what they need to be producing for themselves, and transfer value into the core. And Norway benefits prodigiously from this. All of the core economies do. But that has to be recognized, right? So this idea that the Scandinavian countries, for example, are, don't benefit from imperialism, this is not true. But also I want to say, like, I have a touchy relationship with the notion of the imperial mode of living. I don't think we should be blaming the working class for imperial arrangements. I think that we should be blaming capital for imperial arrangements, since they're the ones who create the arrangements. And that's something we need to overcome. I think that we would undo those arrangements, or I would hope,
under more. For those that are not familiar with the imperial mode of living argument, could you just run that briefly? So what? Oh,
yeah. So the idea that, like, the nice consumerist lifestyles that people in the global north enjoy are due to a lot of plunder and exploitation in the global south, right? And this level of consumption that we enjoy would not be possible without imperial dynamics, right? Which is true. At the same time, it's not like a mode of living that we necessarily choose, because again, we don't have economic democracy. And if we did, we might choose, right? We might choose a different mode of living, actually. I mean, again, think about it. If you're part of, I don't know, Zara or H&M, and suddenly you democratize these companies, and then we as workers, as staff of these companies, get to decide, like, how do we actually want to be organizing our supply chains? Do we really want to be brutally exploiting sweatshop workers in Bangladesh? Do we really want to be doing fast fashion advertising that wastes tremendous amounts of resources and water and land and cotton, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, probably not, because we're sane people, right? We have, like, other objectives we want to achieve in the world. And we would probably change the way these companies work quite quickly. But we don't have that option. And so we're stuck with what that arrangement is. And the consequence, actually, is that while we do benefit a lot from this kind of, a lot of cheap goods, a surplus of cheap goods, disposable flat-screen TVs and so on, right? Crazy. We don't have some of the key things that we actually want, right? We don't have autonomy at work. We don't have democracy at work. We don't have economic security. We don't have universal public services. We don't have affordable housing, because those things aren't profitable to capital. And so we have, I think, a kind of, we're not as rich, I think, as we like to think we are.
But when you say we don't have that, we want that, I mean, do you know that people prefer to have a democracy at work and pay $500 for a shirt instead of?
I don't know for sure it'd be $500.
Or something. I mean, because our clothes are ridiculously cheap because we exploit workers elsewhere. But I'm not totally convinced that everybody would recognize that it would be better for everybody to have democracy at work rather than cheap clothes and also including things that are necessary that are cheap. I mean, we don't have to go that many years back in many parts of the world before just to have a pair of shoes to work to school was a luxury, and now it's available even for the poor. There's a lot of things they don't have, but I'm not really sure that they would have more democracy at work and not have.
I mean, fortunately, thanks to the power of industrialization and technology, we can make shoes and clothes more easily. And I think this is important, actually. Like,
and why do we have industrialization and technology?
Well, I was going to emphasize a key point here, which is that, look, I think we often have this idea that capital innovates, but capital doesn't innovate very well, actually. It innovates things that are profitable. Now, in the global south, it's more profitable for foreign capital to exploit cheap labor, because labor is so cheap there, right? Than it is for them to invest in technological innovation that would automate processes like coltan mining, right? Or a sweatshop production, et cetera. Right? Under conditions where we control finance that gets invested in innovation more democratically, we would very quickly say, you know what? We don't want to live in a society where the materials in our phones come from literal slave labor. Under capitalism, literal slave labor. And our chocolate comes from literal slave labor, right? We would not be satisfied, presumably, with this arrangement. And we would say, OK, what can we do immediately to transfer technology and innovate technology that can automate coltan mining and make it more ecological, et cetera, and automate sweatshop production and so on, and liberate people to go about other forms of production that are more necessary, like building schools, right? I think that we could, with more democratic control over finance, we could innovate more effectively for human needs and ecological benefit, which capital only does if it's profitable to do. And that's a major limitation of innovation under capitalism.
Do you want to jump in with the last question before we open for discussion?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah, I do want to come directly back to the decolonization question and its links with degrowth, especially since I think this will be relevant to a lot of people here, but Monday was 700 days since the Supreme Court ruling about the Fosen case, where windmills have been ruled as illegal based on being a human rights violation for Sami reindeer herders. And so, yeah, this example of green extractivism is really top of mind for a lot of us, I imagine, and I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on that and also just in general, the links between degrowth and decolonization. Yeah,
I think it's so important. I met some of the protesters who were camped outside the parliament, and I have to emphasize publicly, I have very strong solidarity with their demands. I think what they're doing is extremely important. And I think that environmentalists need to get on board with that, right? And look, I think that degrowth actually offers an important solution here. Because if you're going to have an economy that has extremely high levels of less necessary production, like an economy like Norway does, and therefore extremely high levels of energy demands, then if you're going to go for 100% renewable energy, you're going to need extremely high levels of renewable energy capacity, which is going to mean a lot of land grabs for windmill farms, or a lot of windmill farms in the ocean, or a lot of land given over to solar panels, and that's a lot of material extraction, most of which, by the way, comes from the global south under extremely ecologically destructive conditions. And so the degrowth proposition, which is scale down less necessary production, reduces energy demands, allows us to decarbonize more quickly, but also means a lot less extractivism is necessary for renewable energy infrastructure, a lot less land grabbing is necessary for that infrastructure, et cetera. And that's, I think, powerful. That's a win, and I think that's a conversation that needs to happen in Norway around precisely this issue. And this is one of the benefits, in a way, right, of renewable energy, is that with fossil fuels, you can have high levels of energy use, and you don't see the consequences, because you're screwing somebody else, right? Future generations, or the global south through climate change, which mostly affects them. With renewable energy, you're forced to confront your energy use. You have to have it here. You have to see it on your mountains, see it in your sea. And then you have to decide, do we really need to use that much energy? Right? And that's a conversation I think we should have. And this is actually where the green hydrogen craze is so interesting, because you can see they're trying to escape this dynamic. If we can just get the global south to produce all the energy, have all the windmills and solar panels there, and generate hydrogen from that production, and then ship the hydrogen here. So we don't have to see the windmills and the solar panels. It'll destroy communities in the Andes, fine, right? This is what green hydrogen is ultimately about, externalizing the cost of energy again, right? So the global south is, again, committed to using their lands, their labor, their industrial capacity to organize around producing something that the north needs to maintain their very high levels of energy use. Unacceptable. All of us should reject that. So, yeah, I mean, I hope that speaks to your question. But it's very clear that in the same way that our economies have colonial dynamics outside of green production has colonial dynamics too. And that's why we need a system transformation, because we can't just accept that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I would just like to thank you so much for this very clarifying conversation, and also for all the other lectures and your public outreach. And I think I would like to say that if the world hasn't understood that it's in a crisis, it's not your fault. I think we can conclude that. It's my... Okay, so it's my fault. Okay. That's fine. Thank you also so much, Holy Benna, to contribute a lot to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that.